So determinism basically says that if everything's made of atoms in the world, it can be predicted in principle, and that this includes humans. So we can all be predicted in principle. Now you might say, and the reason I have the roulette wheel there is you might say, yeah, but aren't some things just random events that nobody has any idea what's going to happen, that nobody can predict? I mean, if we could do this, wouldn't we be wouldn't somebody be rich and making money in Vegas and so forth? Well, the answer to that, the determinist says, is we will get there. We just don't have the technology yet. So the determinist says, in principle, things can be predicted. And it's not purely a matter of faith. Some people see that as faith, that a determinist believes that we will be able to predict stuff. It's not purely faith, it's based on evidence, because we've seen that in the past we used to not understand things, and we used to think they were intractable, problems that couldn't be solved, and now we understand them, and there's a very clear causal relationship. I mean, you can see this with medicine, with the way we went from thinking that being sick was a cause of witchcraft, to being sick being caused by germs and so forth. So there's a number of ways that in the past we've predicted how something works, and then we've responded in the future based on our scientific understanding. So if that's the case, then who's to say that there won't be a future from now where we will be able to predict everything that today seems like we can't understand? So a determinist is not fazed by that counterargument. They say, yeah, there's a lot of randomness, but if we knew all the variables and we had the technology, we could still predict it. So think about the roulette wheel, which I have a picture of there, right? That seemingly perfect mesh of unpredictability. And yet, if you could know the exact angle and trajectory of, that the ball was going to come off the dealer's hand and be dropped into the wheel, the exact momentum of the wheel and so forth, and the velocity of the ball, I think you can see what I'm getting at. If you could have a device that could fully predict all those variables, you would know exactly where that ball was going to land by knowing all those prior conditions. So it's not a counter-argument to the determinist to say that. So the argument is, first premise, the physical world is determined by the past and the laws of nature. So let's unpack that for a minute. Now, I'm modernizing the argument. We're jumping forward from the PreSocratics a bit. I'm giving you a more modern understanding of an argument that was started by the PreSocratics. So the argument is, first premise, the physical world is determined by the past and laws of nature. What is that referring to? Well, the past refers to basically the Big Bang, or whether God started it, or there was no God, or the Big Bang happened, or whatever. There was some event that led to what's happening now. So it's actually irrelevant to the argument whether God exists. Either God started it, or the Big Bang started it, and there was nothing. It doesn't matter. Something started it, and here we are. Right? Or nothing started it, but it started, and here we are. That's the point. There's a past series of causes leading to where we are in the present. That's the point of that part of the premise. Now, the laws of nature just refers to all the observable laws through which matter must pass through which matter must pass. So gravity and Newton's laws of motion and so forth. Those are the laws of physics. Now, the PreSocratics didn't have that terminology. They hadn't understood all this yet. So they just talked about it in terms of atoms bumping around according to that logic, that internal logic. But now we have a more specific definition of that internal logic. And those are the laws of nature. So basically that first premise is saying that everything that happens now, all of the physical world we observe, including ourselves and everything in it, is a result of a whole bunch of causes from the beginning of time, the beginning of matter, guided by the laws of nature until we are now here in the present. So it's hard to deny that on some level there's some truth to this, regardless of who you are, right? And so we'll talk later actually about a view that some philosophers have taken on this issue that's called compatibilism. The idea that we are determined in a lot of ways, but that deterministic outlook of the universe, it's still compatible with free will. So in other words, we can still have some wiggle room in our behavior, even if we're ultimately determined by a lot of outside forces. And that's probably the general consensus amongst most philosophers. and scientists too. However, there are many and more people who are starting to come out as full-on determinists. And one of the reasons for that is there's some studies by a scientist named Benjamin Libet, who discovered that people in a laboratory environment, he was able to predict their decisions, like basic decisions, like choosing between like an apple and a pear or something. And he'd have participants in his studies, he'd ask them various questions, and but he would, when he was asking them questions, he had their brains wired in. I think it was an EKG or one of those devices that measures the brain waves and activity. And based on his knowledge and understanding of the brain, he was actually able to predict people's choices of very basic choices before they chose with a pretty high degree of accuracy. So that suggests we don't have free will, right? Because if people, here's the kicker: the people in the experiment, they thought they were making free choices. They were like, "Yeah, I chose this freely," and yet the scientist was able to predict their choices before they even made them. Doesn't that suggest that our brains are wired to make us think we have free will? Anyways, I'm not coming down on either side here, as I usually do not, but there is some interesting evidence pointing towards determinism that has recently come out, historically recently. So the second premise, though, is where people mainly disagree. Because the second premise says, because people might say, well, all right, yeah, the physical world is determined by these forces on some level. But once you throw humans in there, people start to say, well, but humans, we're not fully part of the physical world, are we? Right? Some of you are probably thinking, yeah, I have a physical body, you have hands and feet, and you have to eat food and so forth and get rid of it. But don't you have a soul? Right? Isn't the part of who you are that is a soul, isn't that non-physical? And so wouldn't that not be determined? Well, a couple things to say to that. The first one is that it depends what you mean by soul. There's actually no clear scientific evidence for a soul. Although lots of research yet still should be done. Also, it's very important to understand, to define what we mean by a soul. But the second point is that even if there is some sort of a non-physical soul, it seems like, doesn't that just push the explanation up a step? Like, how do we explain that our soul is free, right? Where does the freedom of our soul come from? Aren't we being determined by our soul then? So in other words, if I say I don't have a soul and then I'm determined by the physical world, but then I say, oh no, but I do have a soul, so that takes away the determinism. But isn't the soul just another level of determinism? Whether I'm determined in my behavior by the physical world around me or by my soul, is there a difference? Right? I don't know. Maybe there is. I'm just throwing that out there, that some have criticized the soul argument for just not really addressing the question, because all it does is say that we're determined by our soul instead of by something else. So anyways, people disagree with that. Now, sometimes people bring in quantum physics here, and this really annoys a lot of scientists, because quantum physics is a highly specialized theory that was created really by scientists for other scientists, and they didn't intend it to have a lot of implications that people like, unfortunately, Deepak Chopra like to repeat. Now, I like Deepak Chopra in a lot of ways. I think he's a very happy, person who probably helps a lot of people, but he does sometimes speak of scientific terms in an inaccurate way. So quantum physics, let's think about that. What people typically say, who usually don't have a very good understanding of quantum physics, they argue that we're not determined because quantum physics shows that there's some level of uncertainty to reality as a whole. So, in other words, there's a famous experiment called the double slit experiment, and I'm not going to go into depth here, but it basically suggests that the way the experiment is run, the result of the experiment depends on the perspective of the experimenter. So if you look at it at a particular time, it looks like the light going through the slits comes out as a wave. If you look at it at another time, it looks like a particle. And in science, you want to be able to say, no, it's either one thing or the other. It can't be both. But the results of these experiments in quantum physics actually suggest that it's more complex, that it actually suggests that there isn't a clear answer. Yeah, that it is more complex. There isn't a clear answer at every time. Now, to be fair, it's still a highly predictive theory that has helped us build computers and more. But the theory, there's this degree of uncertainty there. And so some people use that to say, well, see, that means that there's uncertainty in our behavior. But the problem with that is the link between the way stuff happens at the quantum physical level and the way stuff happens at what's called Newtonian level. To put it simply, small stuff versus big stuff. So there may be some uncertainty at the level of small stuff, atoms and so forth, but we haven't really found that translates to uncertainty at the level of big stuff. And guess what? We're at the level of big stuff. That's where our free will is supposed to exist, not at the level of atoms. So I told you about the metaphysical part of determinism and the ways that all our behavior currently in the present moment may be determined. And by the way, that would include that even if I have the feeling of choice, like right now, it's like, I could talk about determinism or I could talk about something else. I have the feeling that I have a choice. But determinists would just say, yeah, but that feeling itself was a product of prior causes. That feeling itself was determined by previous causes. So just because you feel free, in other words, doesn't mean you are free. Let's not forget the appeal to emotion fallacy. The feeling of freedom doesn't guarantee freedom. After all, an ant in an ant farm that you control probably feels free from within. It can move around back and forth. But is the ant truly free? No. In a deep sense, no. So freedom isn't based upon one's feeling of it. So we should remember that too. But here's the moral part. So the moral part of free will is, if we are determined and we have no choice in how we behave, well then, can we be praised and blamed for what we do? Right? This is the worry, that if determinism is true, if it's true that we have no free will in what we do, it would be hard to blame someone for doing something bad, wouldn't it? Because they couldn't have chosen otherwise. If somebody, if a dog eats something off the table, you might say, hey, bad Rover or whatever, but you don't get deeply mad at the dog because he doesn't understand any better. He couldn't really have done anything different. But with people, the reason we blame people is exactly because they could have done something different. That's the whole point. The whole reason we put them in jail. We say, you were a killer, other people went through similar circumstances, and they didn't kill. Other people suffered too, but you suffered and you killed. You chose to do it, right? That's typically the way we see it. But notice that if determinism is true, it's not, you can't make that same argument. You can't say that, oh, well, this person went through these similar circumstances, and this one didn't kill and he did. Because for a determinist, those are two completely different people with two completely different histories, even if they're similar. Whatever led the person to kill, that was part of his specific causal process that led from, point A to point B. And whatever led that other person not to kill, likewise. So you can't really blame people. And so this raises questions for our criminal justice system. Well, if we can't blame someone when they murder someone, what do we do? Some determinists respond here by saying, well, we still blame them in a practical sense. We lock them up because it prevents them from doing future things. But actually, there are some determinists who have argued that we should reform our criminal justice system to be more focused on compassion, because we often get very angry when we hear stories of somebody harming someone else and going to jail for it, but we often don't consider the way their circumstances or even biology may have led them to do that. Not only can we not blame people, if determinism is true, we cannot deeply blame them, but we can't praise them either, because in the same way that it's not your fault if you're a murderer, it's also not your fault if you're a great pianist or a great guitarist or a great speaker. Those are all things that you were just determined to do from birth and actually from the beginning of the universe. So determinism is basically saying, look, there's one possible future. It can't be any other way. It's just like when you put water in 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to turn into ice. It does not happen any differently. That's the way the universe is. In the same way, the present moment must be the way it is, based on the past and the laws of nature.